Corporate Board Member presents an informational webcast. On this edition, Boardroom Trends, is your board prepared? With T.K. Kerstetter, President of Corporate Board Member, and Bob Bostrom, Partner, SNR Denton.
Welcome. My name is T.K. Kerstetter with Corporate Board Member. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this board informational webcast. And we are going to talk about boardroom trends and if your board is prepared. And with me to talk about this topic is Bob Bostrom, who's a partner with SNR Denton. And Bob has been a long-time governance enthusiast, and I think a good place to start might be in the say on pay, because we just can't seem to get away from that. So let's talk a little bit about why that trend is still very relevant, even though we've been through 1 year already.
Tiki, I think what's interesting is the say and pay phenomena is really part of a broader trend going on these days, where boards have been forced to become much more responsive to external exogenous constituencies, shareholders being the primary one and say and pay being a good example. And I think it partially drives some reputational risk, as well as from partially the whole issue of being reelected and not facing the embarrassment of low percentages. And I think this past season, proxy season, with the say and pay phenomena has been a perfect example of that, where we now see boards being very aggressive in reaching out to shareholders and trying to avoid a negative vote, as many companies got last year. And this reach out takes many different approaches, many different contexts, but it's clear that there's much more focus now by the boards on being responsible and being responsive to the demands and the requests of shareholders and shareholder groups in the say and pay issue. And as I said, I think it's partially a reputational issue, partially not being embarrassed about a no vote, but it reflects, I think, a broader trend. It's kind of the poster child of this whole thing, but I think it does reflect a broader trend where the role of the board, the ability to be independent and above the fray, is changing. And I think another factor in that process will be the recent announcements by both BlackRock and CalSTRS that they're not going to outsource to proxy advisors their proxy votes anymore. And I think that's going to also change the dynamic very considerably in terms of shareholders as opposed to proxy advisors putting pressure on boards and trying to get the shareholder view reflected in what the boards are doing.
So if you're a company today that does not have an outreach program and does not know who your shareholder is, you are setting yourself up for an unpleasant experience.
I would confess to you that I was never a big fan of that very aggressive Pfizer model that's been around for so long, but I have to acknowledge I was wrong, and I think it was prescient. And I think for this environment, you need to have a Pfizer-like, a very aggressive, very formalized, very consistent reaching out to shareholders.
Touch back on the say and pay again. I would assume people that passed or met more than 70%, which is the new 50 last year, shouldn't sit on their laurels, because I think that even though we're seeing sort of a good paradigm shift with BlackRock and CalSTRS and doing their own voting, I also understand that they have a year's more experience, and I would expect that they're going to be much more prepared to evaluate people's pay plans than they were last year.
I think the bar is going to be raised considerably, and I think the reputational embarrassment factor of comp committees and boards is also going to be raised considerably, and I don't think they're going to be happy with a 70% anymore. I think it's going to be the 90s, and they're going to have to adapt to get there.
Well, we'll wait and see if the 90 becomes the new 50. Let me ask you about another trend we're just seeing sort of the fringes of right now, and that is the companies that are giving consideration to risk committees.
Risk has become the 800-pound gorilla in the room. It has become one of the key issues. It's multidisciplinary. It affects all aspects of a company. And I think one of the drivers is the velocity of change today. And the best example of velocity of change is really international geopolitical events. And so you look at Iran's threat to mine the Strait of Hormuz and cut off the oil supply for a while. You look at the various geopolitical issues going on, China being another 800-pound gorilla in the international arena. These things are totally, in many respects, unanticipated, but you have to have a plan in place if they come. And that naturally falls to a risk management process into the board. And although we used to do benchmarking when I was at Freddie Mac, and every year we'd benchmark what were our 25 peer group competitors doing in the space of risk. And as you would expect, of the 25, 4 had separate risk committees. Others, probably half of the remainder, had it split between risk and audit. Others had it in the business committee. Others had it at the full board level. So it was kind of all over the range. But I think what we're seeing now is in this past proxy season, a couple of studies have indicated that a lot of companies are now focusing on separate risk committees. And I think it is because the velocity of change, as I said, has increased so dramatically. And it's hard for the full board to focus on all of that and do its day job as well. And so I think there's gradually becoming an awareness that while it's a full board responsibility, you need to allocate that full time to a smaller committee to stay closely abreast, to be able to respond to the velocity of change, to be able to make sure the company has a good enterprise risk management program in place, that they actually take the time to oversee that, to get direct reports, to pay attention to it and focus on it. And I think that reflects this kind of maybe emerging trend now toward having separate risk committees.
Hidden in your response there was something I think that's important if we're talking about boardroom trends and being prepared, and that's crisis management. That's the minimum, regardless of what kind of committee you have. I know that you're a big proponent of making sure that boards are organized with crisis management.
It gets back to this velocity issue and the inability of anybody to anticipate everything that could happen and the speed with which it could happen. And so I used to always be an advocate of it's what you don't know that you worry about. And so you need to have a template, a plan that your organization, both at the management level and at the board level, has in place in order to respond to unanticipated crises or events that happen that are either totally unexpected, unanticipated, or were some that you may have been able to identify, but in fact the low probability, high severity of that event suggested you couldn't dedicate resources to mitigate the potential liability from it. So when those things happen, a board has to understand and be prepared to deal with it in a real-time, sometimes accelerated real-time basis. And you don't have time to think about what will the role of the board be. Will we set up a separate committee to oversee management's response? Will we take over the response? Will we have the lead director do it? Will we have the chairman do it? Will we have a committee do it? Special committee? How are we going to deal with that real-time crisis that's happening? And while the whole board needs to be informed, the whole board can't be real-time helping management make decisions. And I think in many cases, letting the CEO, by him or herself, handle that crisis response is not always the best act. And I recognize that there's always this tension between oversight and management by the board, and board never should leave oversight and get into management. But I do think in this era, and it gets back to some of the things we discussed earlier, boards are being forced to venture closer to that line, in some cases maybe cross that line. And I think in the case of a severe company-threatening crisis, the board does have to be more involved. And the board has to understand ahead of time how it will be involved and what it will do.
Well, we're going to talk about that speed and velocity in a minute, but I want to ask you about something that is not necessarily a trend, but it might come under the classification of noise, okay? There's been some noise that people are looking to change or even eliminate the indemnification of directors within the company structures. That would be monumental. Do you have any more information on the noise? And then, but even if you don't, what would that mean if that is really out there?
I don't have any specifics, TK. I have heard, kind of in the hallway, some similar kind of conversations. That there may be some discussions in state legislatures and other places, but nothing really concrete. I do think it would have a devastating effect on the willingness of individuals to serve as directors, especially given that some of the things we've talked about, the very activist shareholders emerging and taking perhaps their rightful role in overseeing and managing a company. And certainly there's been no dearth of plaintiffs' class action securities fraud suits the past 5 or 6 years. We're going to see more, and I think the more that the board is pushed to get itself involved with decision making, on the one hand it's a good thing, It shows that they're not asleep at the switch. They're not a rubber stamp board. They're involved. They're engaged. They're focused. And I think in most standards, the sentencing guidelines require compliance structures. The board can be liable, care mark, et cetera, that whole line of cases. But I do think that even though board may try to protect itself by being more engaged, that kind of cuts both ways. The more engaged you are, the more you're doing, the more liability you could have. The less engaged you are, the more liability you could have. So walking that fine line between not doing too much and doing enough is going to be a challenge. But clearly, the direction where we are right now is a very litigious one. And certainly, I think it's become tenuous enough for public company boards and the directors that serve on those boards to ensure they have adequate indemnification. I think certainly one of the biggest issues in the boardroom on the annual D&O renewal time is, do we have enough D&O insurance?
Right.
How much is enough? How much should we have? And a lot of the comfort you derive from that is a function of your indemnification. And so I think that given the kind of attention that directors are focusing on their own personal liability and service, it could have a devastating effect on boards.
I hope this is the last time we bring that up, and I hope it is just noise, because I agree. Anybody with any wealth would have to really think twice before putting themselves on the line. Absolutely. So we'll consider that noise rather than trend at this point, but keep a very careful eye out for that. Last thing I would just want to talk about was speed of what happens today versus 5 years ago. Social media has just turned speed upside down. Yeah, you can board a plane, and by the time you get off, something could be viral, and you only been in the air for an hour, and all hell could have broken loose already. So talk a little bit about the change of what speed has required from a board. I mean, you touched on it before, but.
Well, I think the social media point is an excellent one, TK. And I recall about 2 years ago, Bob Schaefer, the renowned journalist, was talking at a luncheon, and it was focused on social media. And he made a very, I think, key and critical distinction between traditional journalism and social media today. And that was that traditional journalism actually does fact-finding and verification before they put something out in the public domain. Social media puts it out without the fact-finding. Yet, it has the same patina, it has the same
maybe even more,
more that traditional journalism has. So the first point about social media is, very simply, it's not always true. And you can't always figure out what's going to be out there. The second thing is a velocity issue. It's massive, it's fast. And I think one of the key to any crisis management plans has to be for a company is to aggressively and actively monitor all the social media sites to try and understand what is the reaction of the external community and various constituencies going to be to the event that's happening to your company. And whether they're true or not, they're out there, and they get said enough, the perception is they are true. So you need to understand what's being said so you can best manage your own outreach efforts in terms of either countering the truthfulness or at least being able to respond to what's going on out there. And I think it's a critical part of any crisis management plan for a company. I mean, you could even argue that there ought to be an active monitoring of social media on an ongoing basis, even without a crisis, to be aware of what is being said about your company, what do you have to overcome in the marketplace.
Well, it probably suggests that you shouldn't have a board filled with 75 to 80-year-olds that aren't familiar with social media, but that would lend itself to a more diverse board, that's for sure, at least diversity of thought. So, listen, Bob, it was great to have your insight on these trends and what's happening in the boardroom, and we hope that you'll join us again sometime.
Thank you, TK. Look forward to it.
And that'll conclude this edition of our Board Informational Webcast. Join us again when we'll cover another critical topic that will help you be a better director, and we'll see you then.
Bob Bostrom can be reached at robert.bostrom@snrdenton.com. This has been a presentation of Corporate Board Member, an NYSE Euronext company.